Every year, the world produces over 250 million tons of salt. But behind that small white crystal on your table hides a road built by an empire, a tax that helped burn down a monarchy, thousands of smugglers thrown in prison, and a barefoot walk to the sea that helped break apart an empire. To understand why salt caused so much trouble, we have to go back to a time before refrigerators, before canning, before any way to keep food from rotting. Salt was the only substance ancient people had that could preserve meat and fish for months at a time, so whoever controlled salt controlled whether an army or a whole city would eat through the winter. Ancient Chinese texts describe organized salt production along the Yellow River as early as the year 6000 before the Common Era, making it one of humanity's oldest industries. In ancient Egypt, salt was a key ingredient in mummification, used to dry out bodies before wrapping them for the afterlife. Deep in the mountains of what is now Austria, archaeologists found something remarkable. A salt mine so well preserved that 4,000-year-old wooden tools and even a miner's leather shoe survived inside it. The salt itself had acted like a natural preservative on the mine, the very same power that made it so valuable for food, now protecting the tools of the people who dug it out. That mine sits near a village called Holstadt, and it was so productive that archaeologists now use the name Holstadt to label an entire era of early European history, the Holstadt culture. In other words, long before Rome, long before France or Britain, an entire chapter of human history was already being defined by who controlled salt. By the time of the Roman Empire, salt had become so central to daily survival that Rome built an entire road just to move it. That road was called the Via Salaria, the Salt Road, stretching from salt pans near Rome all the way across the Apennine Mountains to the Adriatic coast. There is a popular legend that Roman soldiers were sometimes paid in salt instead of coins, and that this is where the English word salary comes from. Modern historians now say that part is probably a myth. The word salarium most likely referred to a soldier's allowance for buying salt, not actual salt handed out as payment. Even so, the connection between salt and money was real enough that the word survived for 2,000 years, long after anyone remembered exactly why. As trade networks grew across medieval Europe, entire towns rose and grew rich purely because they sat on top of salt deposits. One of the clearest examples is a city in the Alps whose name literally means salt fortress, Salzburg. For centuries, local archbishops in Salzburg grew enormously wealthy by taxing salt mined from the nearby mountains, funding grand palaces and churches that still stand today. Salt did not just make individual towns rich, it helped build entire empires. Consider the rise of one small city built on a lagoon in northern Italy, Venice. In its early centuries, Venice had few natural resources of its own, but it did control valuable salt pans along the Adriatic coast, and it used that control aggressively. Venetian merchants forced neighboring territories to buy salt only from them and used the enormous profits to fund the ships and trading posts that grew into a vast maritime empire. This salt monopoly grew so fierce that it helped trigger a real war in the 1300s when Venice fought its rival city Genoa for control of salt-rich territory near Chioggia. Venice eventually won that war, and historians consider control of salt one of the quiet foundations behind its centuries of wealth and naval power. Because salt was this valuable, governments everywhere eventually noticed the same thing. A substance that everyone needs is also a substance everyone can be taxed on. Nowhere did this idea go further than in France, where the king created a salt tax known as the gabelle. Under the gabelle, French households in most regions were legally required to buy a fixed amount of salt every year at a price set by the crown, whether they needed it or not. Worse, the price of salt could differ enormously between regions of the very same country, since local nobles held exclusive rights to sell it. This price gap created a booming underground business, smuggling salt from cheap regions into expensive ones, carried out by networks known as faux-sauniers, or false salt sellers. Getting caught smuggling salt was not a minor crime. Tens of thousands of French men, women, and even children were imprisoned, sent to the galleys or worse over the salt tax. By the late 1700s, resentment over the gabelle had spread through nearly every level of French society, from starving peasants to frustrated merchants. Historians do not say the salt tax alone caused the French Revolution in 1789, but they agree it was one of the clearest daily symbols of royal unfairness that pushed ordinary people toward revolt. One of the very first acts of the new revolutionary government in 1790 was to abolish the gabelle completely, a decision celebrated across the country. But salt taxes did not disappear from history. A century later, on the other side of the world, a very similar story was about to repeat itself on an even larger scale. By the 1800s, the British colonial government in India held a strict monopoly over salt production and sale across the entire subcontinent. Indians were legally forbidden from making their own salt, even along their own coastline, even though salt occurs naturally in seawater and could be collected almost for free. Instead, every household was forced to buy heavily taxed salt sold by the British government, a tax that fell hardest on India's poorest families, who needed salt just as much as anyone else. In March of 1930, an elderly independence leader decided this law was the perfect symbol to challenge British rule without a single act of violence. He set out on foot from his home, walking toward the Arabian Sea, together with a small group of followers that grew larger with every single day. The march covered nearly 240 miles and lasted 24 days, drawing enormous crowds and worldwide newspaper attention as it went. On the morning of April 6th, he finally reached the coastal village of Dandi, walked into the surf, and bent down to pick up a small lump of natural sea salt from the sand. That single simple act broke British law, but its real power was symbolic. A barefoot old man showing millions of people that an unjust law could simply be defied. Within weeks, ordinary people all across India were illegally making their own salt on beaches and riverbanks, and tens of thousands were arrested for it, including the leader himself. The Salt March did not end British rule in India by itself, but historians widely consider it the moment that turned India's independence movement into a truly mass movement, one that could no longer be ignored. India finally gained independence in 1947, 17 years after that walk to the sea, and the humble crystal that sparked it never lost its symbolic weight. Today, salt production looks nothing like it did in Roman times or colonial India. Most of the world's salt now comes from industrial mining and evaporation ponds the size of small cities. Only a small fraction, less than 10%, is actually used for cooking. The rest goes into de-icing roads, manufacturing chemicals, and countless industrial processes. So the next time you sprinkle a pinch of salt on your food, remember what is really inside that small white crystal. An ancient Roman road, a myth about soldiers' pay, thousands of imprisoned smugglers, attacks that helped topple a monarchy, and a barefoot walk that helped free a nation.